So what we'll do is I have one question to Stefan and he wants to add certain things. Then I'll take advantage of my position here and ask a few questions and then move into the house. So Stefan, just one question in terms of like understanding the panel. Generally, like this is just I've heard, so YouGov is an online panel. So people voluntarily sign to your system and then they become a member of your sort of like online community or database. Now, do you pay them each time they take your survey, or this is just a sort of like voluntary basis people are?
Yes, we do pay,
Okay.
and they get on average, I don't know what it is here in currency terms, but throughout the world it's about $1 a survey,
Okay.
and when you hit 50, you get paid out in cash.
Okay.
And we think that's very important, that we give people a reason other than wanting to express themselves, which is obviously an important piece of it, in order to get well-balanced panels. And of course people say, well, how do we know that the desire to join a panel doesn't have an effect on the sort of views you have? And all I can say is, I mean, there is no way, of course, of proving it, except to say that we are very heavily in the business of predictions. If ever there's an election, we make a prediction, which we publish, where it is, where we have media relationships, and we have a very high, we actually say we have the highest in the world record of accuracy, which we can demonstrate. Certainly, we have in the US and the UK, where we do, in the US we do hundreds of predictions, because we do Senate races as well as national and sometimes congressional races even, and in the UK we've had plenty of experience of those as well, and we are very close to accurate. We also make lots of commercial predictions as well, things that are published, so that we say, well, is Apple going to announce higher or lower earnings based on the sales of the iPhone or whatever. So these are all questions asked by the same panelists as answer these questions. And because we are consistently accurate in what we predict, it's the only way that I could possibly attempt to convince you that the fact that somebody is on our panel makes them not different to people who are not on our panel, if you compare like for like across the two. It doesn't seem to be, the desire to be or the willingness to be on a panel does not seem to affect your range of and the types of views you had. I did want to just add before we open up, I had another page of notes which I couldn't find, just a few other pieces in there outside of the direct question that go alongside globalization. It's very noticeable. There's a very much higher level of trust, for all media, but particularly of social media in the developing countries, and in the UK, in the America, there's been in Germany there's been a real worry about privacy. There's been a huge worry about the nature of the debate online, which is sort of is very limited, people living in their own, as it were, thought groups and so forth. Much more positivity in developing countries. There's a broad acceptance of English as a lingua franca, implied by when you ask people what language they should learn. 85% say it's important to learn English. Only 35% say it's important to learn Chinese. So it is a recognition of the globalization, I think, of the world. The developing world is much more interested in brands. If we say it's important, how many people say it's important, very important in fact, to buy things that are strong brands? 30% amongst the developing countries on average versus 12% amongst Western countries. That's a very significant difference of those who say it's very important, and also higher amongst important, and then the reverse down the other end. They say fashion is more important, following fashion is more important in developing countries than in the West. We also asked about views of other countries, the views of China, the views on China and Russia, much more positive in the developing countries, even after you take out China and Russia, obviously, and also much less negative on the president of President Xi and President Putin. Very negative views in the West, much less so. And we asked a very simple question: how important is it to be a citizen of the world? Do you consider yourself to be a citizen of the world? 21% of Western countries said yes, that they did. 39% of our non-developing countries, non-developed countries, said that as well. So on another, on a whole set of other measures, you can say that it is not simply that things are getting relatively better in developing countries economically, as we know they are, relative to the West, as in this last period of some decline in Western countries. Not only that, obviously the relative position is different, there is a wider acceptance of the broader world, I think, on other measures as well.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is, in a way of summarizing what you both said, throw out a hypothesis. I'm not sure if that is right, but I think there is a complex picture emerging from the two presentations. One, my hypothesis for why there is a higher support for globalization in the East is because so the target population in your survey is actually which is benefiting from globalization now. So this is a group which is basically going to the West for studies and jobs and other things, and that's why there is a higher support. Whereas the same group in the West is now sort of like getting hurt because of this process. In a way, they are losing out of jobs. They are also probably losing out positions in the universities. So now globalization is basically benefiting a very different set of population, and that's why the geography for the support is sort of shifting. What is interesting in some ways, so both the presentation sort of point to that there is some sort of optimism and aspiration behind this pro-globalization consensus, and this optimism is not sort of like there's lesser support for democratic means, which means that there is an impatience and they want rapid mobility on economic front and other things, but then from its findings are sort of like adds a bit of complexity where people still want a sort of an activist state. So there is an impatience for faster development, but then they think that state is the medium for that development. And second level of complexity is that despite this pro-globalization consensus, liberal norms are not emerging. So there is still conservative belief on many of these questions. Religiosity still remains high. So globalization as a force is also acting very differently in the East. That's my summary.
That's a good thing.
Okay.
And I think it's to agree with that, especially the last stuff about the millennials and so on. We did a study as well in Europe that was not dissimilar from this, and also found that the young, well, they're different because they're young. They're not so different because they were born in a particular period. So, in fact, on a lot of attitudes, for example, towards things like intervention in the state and so on, state intervention, they were not as different as you would expect. People thought there'd be a much more difference between the old and the young, and across different countries it varied in different ways. There wasn't a single thing emerging there. And one question that we had asked was, do you think that you are more similar or more different to your parents than they were to their parents. It's a complicated question, but we demonstrated. And the conclusion of it was that you have to sort of then look at the answers of the different age groups, is that young people consider themselves more like their parents than their parents consider themselves like their parents. In other words, they don't, in fact, there's a reduction in the degree to which young people think they're different, which surprised us. It's a complicated, it's easier to demonstrate visually than I should have done. But,
anyone, any questions? Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You have raised a very valid points about the East and West wisdom, I should say. And the wisdom is a very difficult word. It is different from intellectuals. What you are doing is intellectual sort of study, whereas when the wisdom comes, the education, social security, health becomes imperative. And then on the top of it, the Eastern philosophy believes in soul and the evolution of soul and the evolution of mankind. So I don't know whether your religiosity includes all these things. And secondly, the material growth of the West and developing countries has overtaken the Eastern philosophy, and it is riding high. So there is a very big gap between patriotism, nationalism at a lower scale and at a higher scale. So how to balance all these, your study doesn't hold those, parameters. What do you say about it?
Can we collect some questions?
Yeah.
Anyone else? Any question? Yeah, sir.
How exactly did you define globalization in your sort of manner?
Yeah.
That would make it easier, perhaps, to disaggregate the factors which led to different attitudes.
Yeah, it's absolutely, and I'll look this up in between someone else talking, because there's lots of questions in here. This is a long survey, and we asked lots of different questions, like where would you study, and where have you traveled to, and do you think that certain, what the effects are of immigration on things, and so on, so that we got people thinking about internationalism, if you like, and the effects of movement and so on beforehand. And then we define globalization in ways that I'll read it out to you in a moment. But there are, we did explain that it was the effect of trade and so on. I'll read that out to you when someone else is answering a question. I'll get you the exact answers to that.
Well, my sort of footnote to that is that the impact of globalization on depending on definition that you've used, on the lives in the West might have been more serious than the impact of globalization on the lives in the East as they understood the phenomenon. I'm just that was
sure.
Gen Z should be asking some questions. That's generation, and it's not Instagram
I
now.
have one question to permit. It's interesting that in your comparison between BJP and non-BJP, practically no difference as you go down the whole scale. Then why did they vote so differently? Why in the beginning, the very first thing they say, they support BJP, don't support this. But then when you come to all the sort of things that determine their life attitudes, there's no difference between the two. Sorry.
Yeah, please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for opportunity for a very informative presentation and discussion afterwards. I think my question goes to Shakespeare. In the beginning of this discussion, you presented some data on trends in the West and trends in the East, and especially about optimism and attitudes towards the future. And my question is relating to that, in that do you see any, is this trend of the West being generally less optimistic, less ambitious about the future? Is it homogeneous across the West, or are there certain countries or regions in the West that stand out and are, for some reason or the other, explainable or not, more positive, more optimistic, and have a brighter outlook for the future?
I was going to say them together. I didn't mean to answer.
No,
So,
please.
I'll-
If you want to answer these questions.
Well, I'll answer that quickly to say it's not homogeneous in the sense that it's not all the same, but it is overwhelmingly, when you aggregate them, the differences are clear, but when you look at them separately as well, the same countries are low, that is to say, the US, America, even the Nordics and so on. It's across all those countries. You don't find a developed country where people are really optimistic. So not homogeneous would be too strong a word, but it is a clear difference in that, and probably for the reasons that you described, I think, because of the economic experience.
Would you like to respond?
Yeah, it's a very hard question. You're asking me something that surveys would be very difficult to delve into, and your observation is, I mean, we're asking here very much questions about economic experience and very practical kinds of things. You're right to say that it would reveal more if we added this to other pieces. Now, this is, of course, one of the advantages of our methodology, that were we to ask a series of questions about values, for example, then we could add it on top of this and cross-reference them, and we can still do that, because although some of these are in countries where we don't have panels and therefore they're not ours, we can't do it, where it's our own panels, we can in fact go back and do that. So I think it's a really interesting topic, which we have very little evidence for in here, because we weren't looking for that. Yeah.
Zenzi, what is happening right now is not Instagram. I am reading things that TikTok is becoming sort of like the most.
TikTok option was not there when the survey was sort of conducted.
Such rapid changes are happening. People are stealing smartphones to able to shoot better videos, because that creates more followers on TikTok. Yeah, so TikTok is the next time from it you should be. You have like question to
Yeah, so sorry, to be very frank, I don't have a full or complete answer to that. And in fact, it is from this survey alone, it's very hard to say what are the differences. My hunch, and this comes from looking at other pieces of evidence as well as some parts of this, is that there are things that perhaps either we feel or the respondent wouldn't want to state. That creates a difference between someone who is vocally supportive of the BJP and someone who is not. The other part, so that is one. So for instance, say whether the country is becoming more and more insecure because of illegal immigrants is something we didn't ask, and something which even in an online survey people may not give a straight answer to, and that may influence. Are there certain kinds of people I don't like, and who in the current polity should be placed lower down the socio-political ladder. But in questions related to food habits, it comes through. You don't like people who eat beef, you don't like people who eat meat, you don't like people who drink. So even among the youth, so the drink thing even among the youth was very strong. So that I think is one clue. The other is that, as I said, and which other political scientists have also pointed out, that if you don't have a credible alternative, an alternative which you believe will address the questions of joblessness, of corruption, of safety of Finland, of other things that you care about, then you might as well give the incumbent a second chance, not because you love the dear leader. So that is.
Sir.
Thank you, sir. My question is another observations to Mr. Stephens. Sir, you have made few quotes. World getting better. UK 16, Germany 13. Now, before I go ahead, let me introduce myself. I'm a student of comparative studies and the evolution of histories. And I lived in your part of the world, in London especially, for 15 years. And I've been an activist amongst the youth. And what I observed then, during that period, I've been going around Europe, other part as well. Those observations that's coming through here now. The youths were disillusioned then and confused and not going well with the governments, respective governments in Europe. And this is all coming in here. I can see that. 13% don't believe. And then citizens of the world, West believes 21 and rest 39.
Yeah.
It's good for them but not for them.
21.
Again, why?
Yeah.
See, this is downtrend in the West. The population, people over there, those who were at one time, at the empire state or the colonial era, they were at the height of everything. The sun will never set. Now that illusion, sun will never set, is dimming slowly. And that is affecting. And moreover, the world has seen rationalism, right? We have seen a trend of rationalism, the Soviet era and so on and so forth. And there was a wave, and still the wave is persisting. The youths are inclined to that way. The middle age is somewhere else, and the oldies are resting somewhere else, right? The respective government, is ruled by the ruling elites, so to say. There's totally isolated from the commoners, of the other people, and the youth especially. Now this is all coming on, and this is very alarming. This is very alarming, and this is true figure. I agree. I agree. They have the reason to be so. They have reason to. And the thing that has emerged, this alarm thing, they have confused on the democracy. I am confused that I believe, my personal, being a student of history, my observation is there is a socialist trend, rational trend, so to say, right? Rationalism is there, and non-rational part. The youth see in two ways. Rational, I am rationalist, I am not rational. I am nationalist, I am this,
So
I am
may I ask you to, please.
The question is, the youth is confused between two now. Politically speaking, they are confused between two. Go for rationalism, go for democracy, or go for socialism. And two can't coexist, sir. As far as I am concerned, two can't coexist. Either that or that. And youth is caught in between two. And the word that we are pursuing now, what policy the West is pursuing now, in place of the immigrants, right? That is telling on the youth, let me tell you very frankly. They can't take it. And that is why they say 16% and here is 21%. They don't see future because the policies of the ruling elites of the West.
Ma'am, you had a question. Yeah.
This is probably best directed towards yourselves. And this is to do with the fact that I think you said a little while ago. Can you hear me?
Loud.
So I think you mentioned something like there's a lot more, not just there's a lot more optimism in the developing countries, but also there's a lot more trust when it comes to social media. Can you just kind of elaborate on that bit and with what you meant by trust?
Well,
when you're interacting with somebody, you trust them more, or you trust them that more? And stuff?
We specifically asked about, I wish I had a quicker way through this. I've got the globalization definition now, I'll come back to that in a moment. We specifically asked how much do you trust these different types of media, I think to tell the truth or something like that. Across all types of media, there was more trust. So television news, printed news and social media, but it was most striking in social media. I think it's worth adding as well, when I come back to your point on the citizen of the world part and so on, we also asked how important is it to be a citizen, to see yourself as a local citizen, to see yourself as a regional citizen, as a national citizen, and it's interesting that on all forms of identity, the West had lower numbers than it's called the East, or the developing countries. In other words, yes, twice as likely to see themselves as citizens of the world, but also more likely to see themselves as local citizens. In the UK, people are not identifying so much as being a local citizen. Same with the nation and so forth. So there's a greater sense of belonging, a greater sense of trust. I think you would say from this data that people are somehow more organically connected, and I suppose if you're using very general kind of concepts, there's a greater sense of alienation in the West, and it could be simply that these are variations on that. So you don't trust things, you don't believe things, and you don't feel part of things. So
there was this point which came out about decline in liberal values. That one understands because that's a global phenomenon, and very clearly, assigned reasons for that. Loss of trust in role models, institutions, etc. But the disproportionate decline in liberal values in the younger lot, which is millennials, post-millennials, that seems counterintuitive to me. I think Pramit's presentation referred to that. And why I'm saying that is because if you think about it, when you're young, your belief in establishment is less. You're more individualized than you are socialized. So it just seems to be somewhere not stacking up. So could you explain that?
Yeah, so on social issues, they are more liberal than the old. I don't know if I had that slide here, but on most social issues, they are. But when it comes to economic issues, the role of the state, they're not liberal. Yeah, and that also is that also comes out in the CSDS youth survey, right? When it comes to jobs, for instance, they're very vocal that no matter who provides a job, they need jobs. So I think it comes from an insecurity of the times we live in. It reflects that, and which is also reflected in official data on jobs, that we haven't had this kind of a job situation in the past many years. So that is one. The other thing, and this comes from my analysis of financial sector data, because I primarily report on the economy, is that when you look at company reports and you call out what they have filed about jobs numbers, about wages, there is sharp decline in the wage bill. So you may discount the employee numbers, some may be low paid, some may be high paid, but there is a sharp decline in the 2014 to 18 period when it comes to the wage bill. Even if you account for lower inflation, it is very strikingly low compared to the 2004 to 8 period. So whether or not you believe in GDP numbers, whether or not you believe in other things, there is a wage slowdown reflected in company reports. There is a similar real wage slowdown when you look at the industrial sector. Rural wages we all know about. I mean, that is a standard high frequency number that we get. We don't need to do much for that. So overall, even in this, I think the post-liberalization experience for youngsters, the current, especially Gen Z and younger millennials, has not been that benign or that rosy as they saw in the case of their elder brothers, their elder sisters, or the generation just ahead of them, which got in the job market at a time when things were booming. There was a lot of activity going on globally. There was a boom. Indians were being recruited by companies from all over the world and so on. That phase is over. And even in the Indian corporate data, it shows that even so, if you look at the 2000 to 2008-9 period, almost half of Sensex companies were acquiring companies elsewhere. They were sending Indians to manage those plants. And in the UK, there were protests when Tata bought Jaguar. So that phase is completely over now. Even in India, companies are not investing. So some reflection of that is bound to happen at some stage, and I think the wheels are starting to turn, and I think politicians have a much better sense than we do of this, which is why the state itself has turned much more activist, and leaders cutting across party lines are much more statist in their arguments. Before the elections, we had Congress BJP competing to offer different kinds of statist solutions to whatever the problem be it of wages or jobs. There was no market-linked solution from any side. Even from a prime minister who in 2014 was talking about many market-friendly policies. In 2019, there was none of that. In fact, the thing that government should not be in business was many years ago. He may reiterate some of these things in an interview to Economic Times just to assuage the sentiments of the Sensex tanks by 1,000 points. But overall, there is a move towards statism. Let's accept that. And it reflects the people's democratic aspirations, if I may put it that way.
I think you also referenced whether things are changing, to what degree they're moving. This survey doesn't really doesn't tell you if things are getting more or less. I mean, it asks people whether they think it's getting more or less, but it doesn't tell you. Now, the real value, in my view, almost of all data, is tracking data, is when you can compare the same questions asked to the same kinds of people one year into the next, and you see the difference, because there's no absolute value to these, right? It's really the change. And so a lot of these questions that are asked here are going to tell us more as the years pass. So, for example, we ask, how many of your friends are not from your own neighborhood? How often have you visited such and such place? How often do you watch American TV or TV shows or European this, that, or the other? Those numbers are interesting in themselves as comparisons, but as time goes on, the degree to which some of these go forward, some of these go back, and the rate will be something that we can bank on as being legitimate comparisons in a way that it's hard to sometimes say within a single survey that things are. So I think that we've set a whole lot of markers in here that will become more and more valuable as time goes on. And it's one of the reasons we would like input back from you when you've had a chance to see the survey and look at the data, where you might say, hey, let's get in right now some other markers that we need to have here. So I do invite you to contribute your thoughts afterwards into the design of this survey.
Bye.
When you're comparing the experience of today's generation to what was, let's say, 2000, is it the same comparison, let's say, in the West and in India? And the reason I'm asking that is, how much of a difference has the cohort made? Is it that the people who are currently graduating out of our schools come from a much broader base than the cohort which used to graduate 20 years ago? And which is, I don't think that will be the case in the West. And is that the thing that's making a difference? Is it the case that the people who are graduating now in India have less quote-unquote social capital, which was not so visible in the success of the previous cohorts? And now that they're actually finding that something is holding them back. And while on observable markers they may be quite similar, but on these unobservable social capital stories they may be quite different. Do you have any sense of your numbers or anything else, that anything that's true at all?
I mean, intuitively it makes sense, and it could be one of the parts of the puzzle, but I don't think we have enough on the background data to be able to sort of distinguish between the older millennials and we don't have enough family information, for instance, in our survey so far. Right?
But if I can add something what Partha was asking and what this sir was asking, I think that the confusion is not on these youngsters having religious beliefs and having conservative beliefs on social questions. So even if the market is not working for them or there's no market-based solution, why is there so much hope in the state to be able to provide them with economic things, right? Because they have also seen state being failing to provide anything.
So if this question were asked before the 2G scam, before the collapse of the telecom thing, before the Ranbaxy scandals, probably would have got a different answer, right? They have seen the state fail their older generation saw the state fail. They saw the market fail in some ways, in many ways. They saw private corporations fail. They saw them being embroiled in all the corrupt deals that politicians and it takes two hands to clap. Right? They saw the private sector being embroiled. You remember the Ratan Tata interview to Shekhar Gupta, where he had to come out and defend himself after the Arya tapes. So these things do sort of, and they have hurt the credibility of capitalists everywhere. And especially in a post-crisis kind of a world where things are not moving at that great speed, I think they're skeptical, and it's also it's not that they're trusting the state. Some sections of them may just be desperate, which is why they want a strong man to fix everything. They want the state to just give them immediate answers.
Is that?
No, please. Can I challenge that? Because, for example, I'm a mentor with the incubator in Ahmedabad, and you have these youngsters which are just buzzing with this whole startup. What is the most aspirational thing for a youngster? Is to get that first round of funding, build up, scale up, exit. So, is that entire thing a myth? Because we are just seeing it through the prism of old economy. It's like what the paradigm probably has shifted. So who are these people who are still looking up to the state?
That, because that is not a representative sample. People who go to IIM.
No, but the guys you spoke to, they are the online guys.
Yeah, so they are not saying that, right? They are saying they want an activist state. They are the ones who want the government to fix things, not the private sector.
No, so I'm saying the reliance on self, the belief in self, and therefore being an entrepreneur, creating your own mountain or whatever. What about that? Does that not exist? They're just looking. So who are these people who comprise the startup ecosystem?
So anyway, the people who go on to fund enterprise, as the collapse of the self-help group model shows, the entire, what was this, SKS microfinance story shows, not everyone can be an entrepreneur. Very few can, in fact, be an entrepreneur. So entrepreneurs, by definition, are the rare species of earth who can take risks that lesser mortals can't.
SKS, any rate was 26. You take a very lead of entrepreneur to be able to succeed at 36.
Yeah, so even if one leaves out SKS, the overall microfinance industry is in poor shape today. And one reason why it is, I think, was this belief that if you just give someone some help in finance and so on, you can turn him or her into an entrepreneur. So that belief, I think,
we might not have an answer to this question, but I think that it is adding another layer of complexity where pro-globalization consensus in the West might have been basically related to the retreat of state, growth of market, where perhaps in the developing world in India, it's an opposite story. So I'll give the closing word to Stefan, and then we'll call it a day.
And what I was about to say is conserve that, because I think it's important to distinguish, or at least to put alongside each other.
Sir, just one word.
Okay.
Why? Sorry, Mr. Stephen. Why only we were concentrating on the market and finances? Maybe a middleman can talk about that, finances. But why we concentrate? This is sorry to say that. Why only finances? Only the market? There's something more than that.
Well, let me address that. So what I was, this isn't probably exactly what you mean, but it's not unrelated. That you've rightly been talking about the battle of ideas, if you like, the idea of the market helping you or not helping you, and part of this is about concepts. So globalization as a concept, and I've got the wording. I'll show it to you in a minute. I won't bore everybody with the whole detail, but it's about how we think about things, but also it's about how we experience things. And one of the experiences that has inevitably changed is you are much more likely to have been helped by the state in some way, just as a matter of fact. So even we've talked about and we've referenced recent declines in perhaps in the amount that the government has been able to do because of austerity, but that's a very brief and recent effect. The bigger effect has been someone who was born 50, 60 years ago will have had very little of help in their youth. Anyone who grows up now expects there to be some sort of supported childcare, a higher education is more supported than it was before. Almost anything you do is much more touched by the state. In fact, Gordon Brown, when he was Prime Minister, said it was one of his ambitions that every single citizen should get something from the state in order to bind them into the state. It was one of his visions. Now, you couldn't have said that 50 years earlier. The state help was viewed as helping the people who are really needy, whereas the concept now is that more and more stuff should be experienced by people. So it isn't just, I think, what people think about things, it's also the effect that they have felt in their lives of the state, and they expect the state to be there for them.
Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I will share the stuff with you.
Yeah.
All right, so...